of service and innovation in business and society as it relates to university industry engagement. So one of the benefits is I get to speak after listening to other people speak, so I can maybe modify my comments slightly based upon those comments. But I do always want to start by giving a little disclaimer that my views don't represent those of the National Academy, so I have to give that little disclaimer at the beginning. Okay, so as I mentioned, our group focuses on university industry collaborations, and I'll start maybe with that and then try to contextualize it into service, science, and innovation. And in today's world, there's a general consensus that collaboration between different sectors, or even within sectors, can catalyze technology development and innovation. So I think there's a generally accepted belief that that's true. Companies and universities are proactively seeking better ways to collaborate, and you see that in terms of the people who are here today. Finally, the U.S. government, as well as state and regional bodies, are trying to find new ways to support collaborations. And I would actually argue that the really exciting activities happening at the state and local level. The federal government has a schizophrenia when it talks about universities and companies working together. They're trying to get their act together, but I think there's some really great action happening at the state and local level. And so therefore, if service science is going to meet the needs of the consumers, which is you all, the question is around value co-creation and how can industry and academia partner to leverage each other's resources, assets, and strengths. And so it was interesting today, we talked about people, so I think it's very interesting that we think about the development of workforce. Amar talked about that being the #1 need, and yet, you know, as we look at universities are very traditional, and it's very difficult to get them to change their focus. And I'll use my wonderfully beautiful and bright wife as an example, who just got her PhD in computer science. She does work developing software with sensors to help autistic children through the development of a robot. The computer science people weren't really comfortable with her because she wasn't a traditional computer scientist. The medical school folks didn't really understand about sensors. And so she was kind of in between. And it was very difficult. And if she wasn't a non-traditional student who was kind of a self-starter, she probably would have pursued the project that she did. So now she's actually going to Yale and in a Center for Institute of Social Robotics, which is a blend, but certainly Institute of Social Robotics didn't exist 10 years ago, just like service science didn't exist a few years ago. So getting the change in academia is going to be a challenge. So when we talk about partnerships, I just want to focus on a few guiding principles that I think we need to focus on when we talk about partnerships. And this really came out of work that my organization did about 10 years ago, focusing on the fact that people tend to work together when it supports their own inherent self-interests. So sometimes we lose sight of that, but I think it's always important to focus on that. People will collaborate if you can find ways to remove transactional barriers. So while some of the things that were proposed around driverless cars sounds great, if there are regulations or barriers to implement those, it's problematic. And so I think we can't lose sight of the fact that while in theory we might want to do something, when we actually get down to the nitty-gritty of trying to get those things implemented, there can be barriers to those. So ways to remove barriers will lead to better partnerships. And then moving away from transactions and focusing on true collaborations, I think is extremely important. Because you can spend a lot of time and energy focusing on a transaction rather than focusing on where to invest time and energy in a longer-term relationship. So when we think about companies and universities, we need to recognize the fact that they clearly have different guiding principles and missions. And so for universities, they want to educate students, they want to create knowledge and disseminate knowledge. And they also want to wind up in U.S. News and World Report, even though no university president will admit it. And I thought that would get a bigger laugh from my university friends, but I guess not. From the flip side, on the industry, they have to create value for their investors, provide useful goods and services, and expand state-of-the-art. So the question is, sometimes those things aren't always in sync, and you have to figure out where you can sync those together. And so as we talk about the area of service science and innovation, if there's a clear need for workers, how comfortable will universities be to quote-unquote be job shops to create workers that can then work and serve the needs of industry? And there's a tension there sometimes that we see in other areas, and certainly could occur here as well. So I'll use this slide from DuPont. And Carson, I didn't know you were going to be here. We have Carson Keller. His predecessor was Randy Gunther from DuPont, who headed university partnerships. And these are the criteria that they used at the time to identify university partners that they wanted to work with. And I think if you ask the companies up here today, you would find similar criteria that they would use for looking at where they're going to make their investments with partners. So curriculum, ranking faculty strength, geography, and obviously if you look at this area, it's a fertile environment. There's a critical mass of companies and universities that can work together. The influence of successful alumni, demographics, success in recruiting, which goes back to, once again, this workforce issue. And then finally, success breeds success. So in this nascent area of service science and innovation, to the extent that you can identify successful collaborations, even if they're small, those will lead to bigger and better collaborations downstream. So I put this slide up for my good friend and colleague, Wayne Johnson, who some of you may know, who headed up HP's University Relations Program. And in this slide, it's fairly detailed, but it talks about the myriad of ways that HP partners with universities. And I think for most of your companies, if you're from a company, you would find a lot of symmetry with what is in this slide. And if you're at a university, I think you should also think about broadening the scope of when you think about industry engagement, because it clearly transcends sponsored research or hiring. There are lots and lots of ways to partner together. So I'll give one good example of that. At the University of Illinois, they have a university business consulting group. And that university business consulting group does projects sometimes in design or marketing to help companies with their business needs. It's not pure research. There aren't necessarily publications coming out of it, but it's truly great opportunities for students to gain experience in the real world. So that's just one example. And so on this slide are 25 or so different ways that HP engage universities. And as you think about service science and innovation, I would ask you to be bold and think about different ways that companies and universities can work together to partner to achieve each other's desired outcomes. So, wrapping up my little conversation here about service science and innovation, I would leave you with just a few questions or maybe thoughts. How can service science and innovation benefit from stronger collaborations? How important are the workforce development issues? And I think I already answered that question based upon the prior presentations. And then one group that we haven't really talked about is how do small businesses factor into this overall ecosystem? So when there are startups involved, they're going to have a totally different perspective than the companies that are up here today or you as universities. You know, their funding model is tighter, and they're going to have a different perspective. But they're going to be very critical, my guess is, to this emerging nascent technology area. And then finally, what specific pilots can be undertaken to expand collaborations between the sectors? All right, I'm going to give just a quick infomercial. I did it the opposite way for most of our speakers about the group that I represent, which is the UIDT. We're an organization convened by the National Academies, and we look at the whole issue around collaborations. It's a membership organization. Many of you in this audience are members, but if those of you who aren't, I'll be pleased to tell you more about it. But we totally are focused on this whole issue of developing stronger collaborations between the sectors. So I think with that, I'm going to end with this, and so we leave some time for Q&A. And this is a quote from our friend up the road, Henry Chesbrough and Andrew Garvin. Companies that invest in their innovative capabilities during tough economic times are those that are best when growth returns. Okay. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to the conversation with my colleagues up here on this panel.